I can.
Okay. Um, Meeting is now streaming live. So we're live now, Ari?
No. We're just doing what we always do, where we connect to YouTube. So it says it's live on Zoom, but it's not live yet.
Okay. Well, I think we're about ready to go. So why don't you hit live, and then we'll
As soon as it connects, I will.
perfect. Then you just tell us when I should introduce Chris.
Yep.
Do you want me to cover a little bit about who I am and what I do?
Yeah, I'll start just by introducing you,
Yep.
and then absolutely give us some general background on what you do, and then let's just walk through those questions.
Yep.
Okay. We can go live if you guys feel ready.
I'm ready.
So, okay, Ariana, we're live now.
We're going live right now. We're live.
Okay, thanks for connecting us, Ariana. So I'm Mayor Tim Rogers from the Village of New Paltz, and I'm here this morning with Chris Farrell from Ulster County Probation Department. He leads the sex offender unit, and I reached out to Chris because there's been a lot of discussion in our community about a hotel on Route 299 just east of our village, but definitely within the town of New Paltz, that is scheduled. And I'm not even sure whether this has already occurred, whether some registered sex offenders have been placed there, or if that's just the plan. Chris will go into details, helping us understand what's going on with those particular individuals. But I really felt it was important to have a conversation like this, to speak directly to an individual who knows a great deal about, on the ground decision making and just, policies and laws regarding sex offenders. One of the reasons that I think it's important to have this conversation is because, this is unintuitive stuff. It's hard to understand generally, but it's an emotionally charged topic. We've been contacted by numerous folks within our community who are really feeling a great deal of stress about these developments. And I think the best way, and it's not a magic wand by any means, but the best way to deal with challenging situations like this is to have these kind of hard conversations and try to understand what exactly is involved and what the process is like. And so I'm really pleased that Chris was willing to chat with us. He's the county expert in this field, but I think what's also incredibly interesting is his background. He's currently the president of the BOCES board, and he had served on the Kingston City School District board of education for 10 years, including stints as the VP and the president of the school board. And he's also a town of Esopus council person. So, I feel like he understands what's involved in our job and how we can probably never be too communicative with our constituents. Folks in our world, like, they're always seeking information, they're always seeking clarity. So it's probably always better to err on the side of having these hard conversations and speaking directly to the folks who know the most about this process. So Chris, I'll let you take it from here and introduce yourself. And you already have a list of questions. We can go back and forth, but we can start going one by one at those questions after you do your intro.
Okay, thanks, Tim. And I just wanted to introduce Caroline too. She's my intern. Every year I have two interns from the social work programs around the state, and she's one of my interns. So I'd asked her to attend today just so she could observe this process. I just so the public knows, I've been working with convicted sex offenders for 19 years. As a clinician, I run groups, I do assessments to assess risk, and and provide treatment throughout their time on probation. We also work with parolees because New York State does not have a treatment program in Ulster County, and we are the treatment program. So we, as a courtesy to the state, we provide some assistance to parole with their offenders too. So I wanted to thank Tim for putting this forum together today, because I think that it's very important for the public to be educated and not reactive. This, as he had stated, this is not an easy situation. This is not, nobody likes to think about sex offenders. Nobody really likes to have them in the community. But the reality is that 95% of all convicted sex offenders return to their community. So it's not an issue or a problem that can be ignored or pushed into another community, because the reality is they all return at some point, the majority of them. And so we have to look at it from that perspective. So I'm just going to start with the questions. I was given a set of about 18 questions, and I'm just going to cover them to the best of my ability. And if there's other questions at the end, I think that YouTube is going to be handling questions, so they can fire away too. The first question says, it seems that sex offenders have suddenly been placed at the Econo Lodge on Route 299. Is there an explanation for this? The explanation is that for the last, I think at least 3 years, all level 3s have been contained in the prison system because there have been no places that would accept level 3s under supervision. And recently the Econo Lodge agreed to provide placement for these people. There are level 2s and level 1s in other hotels throughout the county, but they wouldn't take level 3s, but the Econo Lodge agreed to take level 3s. So that's the change and the reason. Prior to that, the state had to house them in the prison, and it was costing an enormous amount of taxpayers' money because they had to house people that were beyond their release date. So that's a short answer to that. The second question is, are most sex offenders on parole and not probation? The majority of sex offenders in hotels are on parole. That's most of our guys on probation have their own houses or apartments and live, throughout the community. But the parolees, initially when they come out, the majority of them are housed in hotels. And then the goal is for them to gain employment and then eventually move, get an apartment and move out. So they're all pretty much on temporary assistance throughout that process. The next question, how many motels, hotels in Ulster County are paid by DSS to take offenders? There are several motels throughout the county that do this. In my own town, I live in Esopus. We have the Capri, and the Capri takes sex offenders in there. There's hotels in Kerhonkson, Saugerties. The one thing that they don't do is they don't house the convicted sex offenders in hotels where they also house families who are under temporary assistance. So there's no mixing of, like, say, you had a woman who had 2 children and she was on temporary assistance and temporarily placed in a hotel. They don't place convicted sex offenders in that hotel. They've had a long-standing policy of not mixing that population, the sex offender population, with families. So that's
Chris, I have a question about that. So if you have a hotel, and then let's just say I'm a random citizen, and I show up at that hotel with my children to get a room because we're on a road trip of some sort, does that hotel, are they obligated to to tell me that there are sex offenders there, especially because I'm checking in with my own children?
I don't believe they're obligated to, but I think the majority of people who come realize that this is a sex offender housing hotel. You know, I think, like, I know that the Capri, they don't have many people staying there other than people on temporary assistance who, are housed there by DSS.
But how would I know that if I'm a
Yeah,
traveler?
unfortunately, there is no way to know that.
Okay.
You know, checking the sex offender registry, because they're required to register if they're level 2 or 3, they're required to register their residents specifically on it. It's on the online posting. So that's how they would know, but for the most part, I don't believe that the hotels are required to give that notification. Although I do think it would be a good idea, a good practice. If there were some legislation, I think that would be a good legislation to mandate, is that if a hotel houses offenders, that they notify.
So does this boil down to a business decision for that hotel operator then? So,
Absolutely. Yeah.
right, so they're choosing to take in sex offenders, and then, because it would seem like that many individuals, and probably most certainly many families with children would then choose not to stay at that hotel any longer.
I would imagine that would be the case, Tim. Yeah. And I think due to the current COVID situation, I think it made them more economically in need of some other revenue stream. And they saw that as a guaranteed revenue stream. So, that does make sense from that perspective. Yeah. So the other question was, does DSS place homeless families who are have children in hotels, motels, where they place sex offenders? And the answer to that is no. They've always done a good job of social services always done a good job of separating those populations and providing different housing for families with children. Next question is it a risk for 2 or more sex offenders to reside close to one another in the same hotel or motel? And are felons not supposed to fraternize with one another? That's actually a good question. At probation and parole, the parole and probation require that their offenders don't fraternize or associate with people like themselves, pretty much. Does that eliminate it? No, that doesn't eliminate it. But one of the things that has come out of this, and there's been some studies that have been put in place recently, is that the offenders tend to tell on each other. So if one offender is behaving in a way that might be violating their conditions of probation, some other offenders may tell the parole officer, hey, so and so is not doing such and such, and so it becomes a situation where they tend to kind of self-police in respect, because I mean most of the offenders that are going there want to move on and have productive lives. There are a small population of offenders who don't have an interest in reforming their behavior, and so those ones typically get called out by their peers quickly, and because they don't want to bring any extra attention upon themselves. The next question was, is it considered to be a risk for offenders to reside in the Econo Lodge in 299 so close to New Paltz High School and Middle School? It's beyond the 1,000-foot rule, and that's the one rule that parole and probation have to follow is when they agree to a residential placement for somebody, it has to be 1,000 feet or more from a school, and it's beyond that reach. Is it a risk? They really haven't found any. All the studies I've read have never found incidents where offenders offend on school grounds. The only time that I can recall of offenders offending at the school is when it's a school personnel who offends against a child. So there really hasn't been anything that speaks to the danger of having a school near a sex offender, because there, there just hasn't been that. That hasn't been the case. So I know it seems like a risky situation to have a school and a sex offender in somewhat close proximity, but there hasn't been any cases that stand out that have where an offender has gone on a school ground and offended against a child.
Well, Chris, I wouldn't think that the question is only interested in whether there's a risk because of, an incident occurring on the school property itself, but just in a community where, there are, there's a density of school age children or college stage students. I think that's the nature of this question.
And if you think about the nature of offending, the majority of offenders who are convicted of a sex offense do not offend against strangers. The majority of sex offenders who offend against children are offending against people they know, and they do that based on relationships, grooming, getting to know the family, getting to know the child. So that's the majority. There are some approximately 10% that are stranger related offenses, but the majority are known to the offender and well known to the offender. So so the proximity of a school, I think it's more. I'd be more concerned about policing one's own family, as far as and acquaintances and people that, and because that's how the offenders typically make their their offending behavior is through the relationships they develop. And so I think certainly you could make the argument that if the offenders are there, will they start relating to the people in the community? Yes, that would be. But I think the thing to remember is that all these placements, especially at the Econo Lodge, are temporary, and the goal is to move these people into more permanent apartments and such, and they could be placed anywhere in Ulster County, not just in New Paltz. New Paltz is just a temporary stop for them. And
Sure. Since we're on this topic, I don't mind kind of doing some of these questions out of order, because our question on the, our final question on this list was how may community members better prepare our children to live in this world where sex offenders exist? So could you, provide for us some rules of thumb or best practices in terms of, parenting?
I mean, I think the best practice in this case is knowing your child, communicating with your child, having an open relationship with your child, making sure your child understands their body and understands that their body is their body, and that nobody is allowed to touch them in any way, shape, or form. I think it's all about education, and relationships. I think that people need to understand who they bring into their lives, and be mindful of that. And I think that's the best way of protecting your children from sex offenders. I think that there's no easy answer. I mean, I think that what I said earlier about 95% of them returning to the community, that's all the more reason why your children should be communicating with you, and you should be communicating with the children, and getting to know your child the best that you can. Clearly children, as they get older, become more secretive, and teenagers don't want to talk to their parents. But I think the earlier you establish that close relationship, the better off you are. It's typically, the typical victim is someone who is a little more alienated from their family, and they reach out to other people for support, and the offenders who do that are very good at identifying possible victims. So I don't know if does that answer your question, Tim?
Yeah, I think as best we can for right now. I understand that, there are some general rules of thumb, but there's also no easy answer because, this just is such a challenging topic. Let's keep going with the questions and maybe we can.
Okay, so the other one said, are offenders on temporary assistance monitored and supervised? Anybody that's on probation and parole are monitored and supervised. Anybody on temporary assistance who's not on probation and parole are not monitored and supervised. So, for example, the recent additions to the Econo Lodge, they're all under parole supervision, and some of them are on electronic monitoring too. What parole does is if they deem that someone is a higher risk, they might put them on a GPS tracking so that they know where they are at all times. And they have a bracelet that they have to wear, and it monitors and tracks them wherever they go. And the parole officer has access to that GPS 24/7. So that, and then there's also with the GPS, they can put together exclusionary zones, like say, for example, schools. So if somebody were to go near a school, the parole officer would get an alert that that person was near the school, or the victim's residence. That would be an exclusionary zone that parole would probably put in, and so if that person went anywhere near the victim, that would make an alert to the parole officer, and they would send somebody out to get that person. The difference with parole and probation is parole, if somebody violates on parole can pick them up and incarcerate them immediately, whereas probation has to go through a court process to do that. So with the parolees, all they have to have is some type of violating behavior, and then they're picked up and incarcerated, and then they eventually have a hearing, and the majority of them are sent back to prison after that violation. So that I think that answers that question. Now, what I would add to that is the parole officer is specially trained for this population, and they have a smaller caseload because there are supervision requirements that are enhanced for sex offenders. So there's whereas like a typical probation or parolee, the officer for those, like say a DWI or something like that, they might have 100 people on their caseload, whereas like our probation officers have approximately 30 sex offenders who they supervise. And I know the parole officer from Ulster County has a small caseload that she does the enhanced supervision. So the next question was, can you explain the difference in the registry level 1 in the registry? So a level 1 is considered a low risk offender. You won't see, like there's a New York State sex offender registry online that you can access. You won't see a level 1 on that registry. If you had information about a level 1, you could access information by calling the New York State registry, but you're not going to see their picture and any identifying information, where you will with level 2s and level 3s. Level 2s are considered moderate offenders, and then level 3 is the highest risk. The difference in requirements, level 1s and level 2s are required to register every year, and they are sent an annual registration form, and they have to fill that out. Whereas every 90 days, a level 3 is required to register their information with the New York State Sex Offender Registry. Level 1s and 2s, they don't publicize information about their exact location, whereas they do with level 3s. Level 1s and 2s have to update their photograph every 3 years, whereas a level 3 has to do it annually. There's also people are unclear about what it's called a designation. And a designation is they've designated somebody either a predicate or a predator or a violent offender. If anybody has a designation, they're required to register for life. They never get off the registry. And a predicate felon is someone who has a prior sex offense. A predator is someone who there was violence involved in the crime beyond the sex offense violence, or a mental abnormality that would make them more prone to sex offending. And a violent offender is someone who had violent behavior in addition to the sex offense violence. So those people with a designation will never get off the registry. Level 1s will get off in 20 years. And level 2s, they can petition the court to be relieved of the registry in 30 years. And any one of the offenders can petition the court at any point in time to have their level lowered, but it's up to the courts to determine that. And the levels are determined by the courts. And for probationers, it's determined around the sentencing time. For parolees, it's the Board of Examiners sends a recommendation down to the local county court, and then the county court judge decides what the level will be.
Chris, can we, so now that, I'm starting to understand this a little bit more, and I just wanted to respond to one of your earlier comments. So were there no places in the county to place level 3s until the Econo Lodge?
Early on, like many years ago, most of the hotels would take any registered offender, the ones that they typically would house. But at one point, about 3 or 4 years ago, the hotels that would typically take any sex offender said they were no longer going to take level 3s. And so what that did was it basically, they can't release somebody to the community unless they have a place for the person to be released to. And so I know of several who have been sitting in prison for the last 3 years beyond their discharge date because of the lack of housing. And it costs a considerable amount more money because they have to put them in a residential treatment facility, which is more costly than your typical prison, and house them there until they can find a suitable arrangement for them to be released to. So years ago, yes, they could, but up for the last 3 or 4 years, they haven't been able to find any place that would house a level 3.
So, I mean, that's been the conversation in our community, is that there are places throughout Ulster County where registered sex offenders reside in different hotels and motels, but up until the placement of these level 3s at the Econo Lodge, there were no level 3s?
There were no level 3s that were on supervision. There are level 3s that live in their own houses or apartments, but none that were under supervision.
None that were still under supervision. Right. So, and I understand that it's incredibly expensive to keep anyone incarcerated, and then like you just described, a residential treatment program is also even more expensive than keeping someone incarcerated. So how was the Econo Lodge identified? Like, did the Econo Lodge reach out to the local government, or did the folks who are figuring out how expensive it is to keep these individuals incarcerated or in treatment program try to identify an area hotel?
The Department of Corrections has like a discharge coordinator, and they've been working for years now trying to find places for level threes, because that's been a specific problem before. And so it wasn't until recently that they identified the Econo Lodge and their willingness to take level three. But up until then, they had been trying to find other places, and like Dutchess County has places for level three that they've housed over the years, but Ulster County, there's been a significant period of time where they've been unable to identify any resources for level threes. Yeah, but
So it was our county uh, corrections department that identified this
York State.
hotel.
The New York State.
New York State.
Yeah, I mean, they're required, they're mandated to try to find housing for convicted offenders who are on parole. And so for years, they've been trying to find a place, and the Econo Lodge just recently agreed to accept. If not, these people would go probably back to the RTFs, and they'd be returned to that situation. So, yeah.
Okay.
So what is the recidivism rate of sex offenders in general compared to the risk of repeat behaviors from 1, 2, 3 offenders? I mean, the recidivism rate of offenders, varies. And it has more to do with the type of offending rather than their level. Like someone who offends with a stranger victim or a male victim, they have higher incidences of recidivism. Someone who has an interfamilial offense, they're much lower recidivism rates. But overall, this New York State did a study recently, and they found that the recidivism rate for sex offenders who had committed an offense was somewhere in the 5 to 6% rate, which is significantly lower than other studies have found. Internationally, the recidivism rate has been between 12 and 24%. The other thing that they found is that sex offenders who are in treatment have lower recidivism rates than sex offenders who deny the need for treatment. So it's and then the other type of offender who has a significantly high offense rate is paraphilic offenders, and that's people who are exhibitionists and voyeurists, because of the compulsive nature of that offending behavior. They tend to repeat that offense because compulsions are very difficult to control. But that's pretty much the recidivism rate. I don't know if Tim, you had any other questions about recidivism rates?
Yeah, I do have another question. So can you describe a little bit about programs that work? Are what is in place in terms of programming and what works best, and maybe for different levels or.
Sure. I mean, the one thing that two things that they found work best is group treatment, and the other is supervision. A supervised individual is less likely to reoffend than an unsupervised. And so, I mean, if I had my druthers, I would take all the significantly dangerous persons and put them on lifetime supervision, because I think that what they found is supervision does decrease the incidences of recidivism. And then they've also found that the treatment makes the offenders less likely to reoffend. So I think the combination of those two things is what lowers recidivism rates. And the standard practice for treatment is a group treatment. I run 4 groups at probation, and we have another psychologist who runs one too. And those groups, I think we've experienced a very low recidivism rate amongst the offenders that have come to our program. And I can only think of a handful that have reoffended over the years, and I've been here 19 years. So I see about 30 new people every year. And we're currently supervising about 100 sex offenders that are on probation. That seemed to, did you have any additional questions about that?
I'm sure others will. Unfortunately, yeah.
All right, I'll continue with the questions.
Yeah, let's keep.
Are victims or family members of victims notified the release and location of the perpetrator? My understanding is that parole does notify the victim when somebody is released. And they're also notified if the person comes before the parole board. So those are the two times that victim gets notified. They do not get notified about specifics as to, the conditions and where they're going to be housed and stuff like that. I think that information does not get publicized to the victim. And then in most cases, the victim has an order of protection in place, and parole, if they have them on GPS, puts that as an exclusionary zone for them. Let's see. What is the impact on family members of individuals on the registry? I think that's a good question. I think often we don't think about these people as having families and having spouses or children. And I think it's an important thing to remember, because the registry not only stigmatizes the offender, which, it's understandable it should, but it also stigmatizes the family of that offender. And so I think that's something that is to be mindful of, because what the registry does is also, it makes it more difficult for them to find housing and find jobs and, kind of regain their life. And, an unstable offender is a homeless offender without a job, without family supports. That one of the things that they found that helps in an offender becoming more reformed is stable connections with people and their family. And so that's something that the registry sometimes destabilizes. And they haven't, unfortunately, the registry hasn't been found to really work and accomplish what it should accomplish, which is to lower recidivism rates. It doesn't lower recidivism rates. It just makes the public feel better because they know where the offenders live. And there hasn't been any studies that have found that it has any impact on reoffense.
Do you have ideas on what could be done to make it more impactful?
I think that, I think unfortunately it's a flawed thing to begin with, because it was put together by political entities, and as it's more of a feel-good thing rather than a clinically based thing, where that, so I don't know that there's much you can do other than looking at who they register. And one of the things that has been promoted by agencies working with sex offenders is having a tool to determine their level based on a scientific model. And I think that currently they're registered based on an instrument that has no scientific backing behind it. There's no empirical value to the instrument they use. And then there's also a judge's discretion. So you can end up with a level 3 who really looks more like a level 1, and vice versa. I think that so I think if they had an instrument, example of that would be like we use an instrument called the Static 99, and that's an instrument that was designed by a group in Canada. And the empirical value of this instrument is significant. And a number of states use that as their instrument to determine level of offenders. And unfortunately, New York State still uses the same instrument they used when they put the registry together in 1986. And it's not a empirically based. There's definitely some empirical value to it, but it's not empirically tested and true. So I think to answer that question is, the one thing I would do is have an instrument that really identifies the most dangerous and the least dangerous. Because one of the things that they found is that if you put a lot of treatment and a lot of efforts into a low-level offender, you can make that person worse. And whereas if you put all your energies and all your treatment energies into higher risk offenders, you can have an impact on their recidivism rates. So let's see. What do you think about the town of Lloyd's license that it's required to house registers? I'm not familiar with that law. Are you, Tim? Somebody wrote that question, and I'm unfamiliar with that law.
I could tell you a little bit about it because I read it directly from the town of Lloyd's. Just posted on their Code 360, which lists all their different town laws.
Mm-hmm.
And the town of New Paltz is considering adopting a similar law in response to this. And it basically assigns points, and I forget the exact numbers, but it's, fewer points for a 1 or 2, and then more for a 3. And then it caps how many points any registered hotel, motel, could have in terms of how many offenders reside at that hotel.
Right.
And I think they split it based on number of rooms. So if it was 50 rooms or fewer, it's 6 points. If it's 51 or more, it's 9 points.
Mm-hmm.
So with 6 points and a hotel that has 50 or fewer rooms, that would be max 2 level 3 offenders.
Okay.
Or I think 6 level 1 offenders.
Okay.
Something along those lines. So you would end up with just a few individuals who are on the registry as opposed to an unlimited amount, or what.
Yeah.
So I think what's challenging about this concept, and generally it feels like once a hotel goes down this path of being willing to receive money to register sex offenders, then why would any regular traveler with children choose to stay there? It seems like they would most likely avoid that place. And then also, as you were describing earlier, that hotel motel would no longer be a place where homeless families or other individuals on assistance could be housed there on a temporary basis.
Right. It pretty much stigmatizes that hotel as the sex offender hotel, and like I know, my experience in Esopus, everybody knows don't go to the Capri because it's where they house sex offenders, and I think that as a hotel owner, I think that would be a dangerous precedence to set. As far as legislating it, I think there's a couple things to look at. Is it may push and motivate New York State to move people in and out of that hotel quicker if they knew they only had 2 or 3 rooms where they were allowed to have level 3 sex offenders. It might put more energies in how to get these people into apartments and stabilized housing, and out of this temporary situation. So from that standpoint, I think it might be a positive thing is to legislate how many numbers of level threes can be housed in a specific location. That I think could have a motivating factor in trying to move them into more permanent housing. You know, but and I think and when I say that, I think that again, I want to remind the public that these people return home. And so we can't keep them in prison forever. And and I would hope that the goal would not be to keep them at the Econo Lodge forever, and that we want to move them back into whatever community they came from, and if they have families, back with their families, as long as they weren't offending against their family. So that would be, I think, some type of legislation around that might be a sensible type of approach. Not say no, they can't be here, but say, we want to place some guidelines and limitations around the numbers of level threes, level twos, level ones. That would make more sense.
Right, and I'm imagining that towns like Lloyd or our town board in New Paltz that's considering this legislation, they couldn't come up with a law that says they will not allow registered sex offenders to reside in their community, but they can create a process. But I guess what you're also describing too is and I'm just learning about all this as we go. So once an individual is in a permanent housing situation, ideally they found a job that can pay for their own housing, so they're no longer on assistance, but then they're in a community. And are they still does the public still get notified in terms of where they reside?
If they're a level 2 and 3, typically the local police department notifies any vulnerable entities. Like I know the schools get notified about offenders in the community, and most schools will keep like a notebook with all the identifying information on those offenders, so that they have that information. Any vulnerable entity is there's a requirement for notification. That's part of the sex offender registry law, and so yes, even if they move into their own apartment, the community is notified. A level 1, they wouldn't be notified of the specific address, but like say somebody moved into Kingston, so they would say there's another offender. This so-and-so is living in zip code 12401. And so then you would know that there's an additional offender living in there. And anyone can look on the New York State registry and pull up Ulster County, and they can find all the level 2s and level 3s that reside in Ulster County. Now, the thing that I would caution people about is a number of those people are in prison, because it also counts any registered offender who's in Shawangunk or any of the Ulster County prisons. So you have to just kind of, when you click on it, it shows you who the offender is and where they reside. And so it, some of them are currently locked up in prisons, but for the most part, like you can put in your zip code and you can identify all the sex offenders that are in your zip code area.
And is this for are there things that registered offenders, whether they're 1, 2, or 3, is that like for the rest of their lives that they're on the registry, or can they do anything that at some point they're no longer part of that system?
Level 1s get off automatically in 20 years. They're removed from the registry. Level 2s can petition after 30 years to be released from the registry. They have to petition the court. And level threes are permanently lifetime on the registry. And
Wow.
also, if you have a designation, you could be a level one with a designation, and you are required to register the rest of your life. And they have to do an annual renewal of their registration, and they have to list any internet accounts that they have, any automobiles that they have, any jobs that they have. And so they're required to list all that when they renew the registration annually. And if they make any changes to their circumstances, like if they move or if they get a new internet address or they get a new vehicle, they have within 10 days, they have to notify the registry of those changes. So say this offender bought a new Toyota vehicle, he has 10 days to get that notification to the New York State Sex Offender Registry so that they can post that change. That's how that works. Any other questions, follow-up questions to that?
No, not about that. So it seems like our next question that we included, because you were unaware of the town of town of Lloyd's licensing requirement. And now that now I'm aware that the town of New Paltz board is considering a similar law. So you're unaware of whether any of the other municipalities within our county have similar laws?
Well, Worthing, about 4 or 5 years ago, established a limitation on the number of consecutive days that temporary housing could be provided at a hotel. And I think that one was being challenged in the court. The majority of these get challenged in the court and often get struck down because of the lack of constitutionality to the laws. But I think that Worthing's the only one I was aware of that had any specific thing, especially tailored around hotels. As far as throughout the state, some municipalities have tried to institute residency restrictions like 1,000 foot for just any offender. Those have been struck down throughout the state as unconstitutional. The only thing that has stood is the 1,000 foot rule for people under supervision, because that becomes a supervision mandate and a condition of their probation or parole. So those people under probation and parole are not allowed to be within 1,000 feet of the school. But I think that the town of New Paltz could look at, but I would urge them to seek, legal guidance, obviously, because it's a tricky situation. I'm not a lawyer, so I couldn't speak to the legality of any specific legislation, other than I know that a number of legislations have been turned down by the higher courts. It says, let's see, this next question. Covered that. Once a sex offender are off assistance, are there laws that would allow municipalities to manage how many live in the community? The simple answer to that is no. I would go, and again, I would remind people that 95% people return to their communities. So you're basically just trying to put a law in that's going to restrict somebody from living in community, and in most cases, the courts are not going to look fondly on this. And then the next question was, how many community members can better prepare children to live in a world? We had talked about this early, but what I wanted to add was, in Canada, they have an interesting program. It's called Circles of Support. And I know I'm going to put this out and it may sound strange. It's where community help offenders reintegrate successfully back into the community. And it does several things. Raises the awareness of the sex abuse and the abuser, and it dispels myths around offenders, and it provides stability for the offender and gives them agency in wanting to do better because of the supports. So that's, it's another way of looking at the problem and saying, well, we can either push the problem aside or we can embrace the problem and get to know these people better. What I found is that the more communities get to know offenders better, they become less scary and more like real people. I think the thing to remember is the majority of offenders who've committed offenses are ashamed of their behavior and don't want to repeat this behavior. There are a small minority who have antisocial tendencies, who look to prey upon people, but the majority are not interested in reoffending, and they're not interested in, and they're interested in, restoring their lives. And so that's, I think that's, if people can look at that from that perspective, I think that these people will become less scary. And, I think that whenever anybody hears the word sex offender, they automatically get an image in their head of who that person is. And I know that even over the years with my interns, a number of the interns came in with preconceived ideas of who these people were. But, after working with them over the year, found that, they're flawed individuals who made a bad decision and took that decision and harmed somebody else. And, but in reality, they're not looking to repeat that behavior, the majority of them. And again, I'm just speaking majority.
Right. I mean, my understanding is that that might be the case for some, um, but perhaps the level 3 sex offenders, it's a serious challenge for them to, get past this, and maybe more than just a situation where they're, they stepped into a mistake and they regret it. Um, you know, can you speak to the psychology behind, part of, why this is so hard? And, I think what we're going to continue to struggle with as a community is, um, whether our discussion today, or even if we have a follow-up, or even if you make some other suggestions of, other entities or agencies that we could speak with, like, how do we get the community to feel more comfortable, with these people who are repeat offenders, and it's not as simple as, well, they regret that they made a one-off mistake.
I think, yeah, and I agree with level 3s who have a history of repeating the offending behavior. Um, those are more dangerous people who you have to be more mindful of. Unfortunately, there's no simple answer. If it were me, there wouldn't be a second or third chance. There, I think somebody should be committed to the correctional facility if they continue to prey on vulnerable people. But that's something the state needs to look at. As far as legislating. But I think in a community, I think that you have to be able to look at the individuals and not put them all in the same group. And I think that that's the key piece is not saying that every sex offender is the same, because that's not the case. And the ones that are more dangerous clearly should be, there should be more strict restrictions and GPS and tighter monitoring, whereas lower level offenders, who made a decision that created harm should, be allowed to, regain their life in some semblance, and level, I think that the level system isn't always the identifying factor of whether this person is hardcore or not hardcore. I think sometimes it's getting to know that person, and unfortunately, most people that aren't in a position like I am, where I've got to know majority of the Ulster County sex offenders, and most of them are people who are wanting to move forward and regain a productive life, but there are some small minority of them who don't, and I think that that's, it it's up to the state to try to, like, if find a way to incarcerate people who aren't abiding by the laws,
Yeah.
and reoffending.
I'm incredibly appreciative that you've taken this time to help us understand this process and how the registry works. Um, yeah, but I'm gonna admit that I'm still a little bit frustrated. I thought it was actually very interesting, the way you described how it was most likely the state's Department of Corrections that probably identified the Econo Lodge and approached the owner,
Mhm.
because it's like you said, it's their fiduciary responsibility to actively find places that are less expensive to house level threes, and up until they identified the Econo Lodge, they did not have a place, like a hotel, to place these dangerous individuals. Um, and it feels curious. It's like, every community matters. Not just New Paltz, and obviously I'm biased as the mayor of our community. So I'm not at all looking at this just from like a NIMBY perspective, and like think that there's some other more appropriate community where this should happen. That doesn't exist. um, um, but I think about the vulnerability of like the women who work at the strip club next door to this facility. Does that create a challenging situation for them, being next to sex offenders? um, and we do without a doubt have a densely populated community with young college age women and K through 12. um, there's serious issues regarding sexual assault throughout Ulster County, but definitely in a college town. Like, sexual predators come to communities like New Paltz, because there are college age women here. And I was on the New York State Thruway this weekend, and I saw the sign. It says lodging, Econo Lodge, like on our thruway.
Yeah.
They're listing the Econo Lodge as a place for um, people to go and check into, as a place for lodging. And it just seems like, I understand the state has a fiduciary responsibility to find places, but is this the wisest way to find housing for these individuals? I'm struggling with this.
I think the answer to that is no. And I mean, certainly if I had my magic wand and were able to create a program, I would require some type of halfway house unit in every town, so that one town isn't the focus of housing dangerous criminals, and I think that is something that the state needs to look at. Is, I think putting an offender in a hotel in and of itself is not a smart decision, because that's not a stable housing situation. And in order to provide stability for these people, you have to put them in stable housing. And I think that it's a flawed plan. And if I were in the community of New Paltz, just like I am in the community of Esopus, I know that Esopus residents are not pleased with the placement of offenders in the Capri. And if I were a New Paltz resident, I would not be pleased with the placement of level 3 offenders at the Econo Lodge. I think the state needs to look at it in a more proactive manner and find transitional housing throughout counties, so that one town doesn't become the primary focus for housing, like, so for example, if somebody's an offender and they're from Saugerties, there should be a Saugerties place where they can return to as a transition before they, get into their own apartment. And it could be a transitional apartment, whatever. But, I think that it's something that the state needs to look at as a more proactive transitioning, because we know that these people are returning to the community, but why should we saddle one community with the most dangerous criminals?
Right. So it's why should we saddle one community? I don't want to see any community saddled with dangerous sex offenders. But also, I think the other takeaway from our conversation is, the stability and higher quality programming. That's how that's probably incredibly important if we're going to reduce recidivism. And a hotel feels incredibly transient. So like placing, these risky individuals in a place that just is transient by nature and feels transient. Is this the wisest decision?
Yeah, yeah, agreed. Yeah, I would say no to that answer. That would be my answer to it,
Yeah. Well, this has been, I know you had to jump. You have to, actually lead a group. You were explaining to me earlier. So, thanks for doing the hard work that you do. So many people in your field do this important work, and I'm sure, you don't get to leave it in the office. It probably stays with you on a regular basis. So,
especially with
thanks for doing this hard work.
now I have to work from home now, so sometimes.
Yeah.
But today I'm in the office. But I want to thank you for the opportunity. I think it's, you're going about this in a proactive way. I think that some communities just have a knee-jerk reaction, and get them out of here is the response. And all it does is pushes the problem over to the other community. And I think that finding some viable solutions is, is a sensible approach. And whether it be limiting the numbers or whatever, I think that that's a more sensible approach than just saying, we're get them out of here.
Yeah.
I think that's,
All right. Well, thanks again, Chris. And we'll probably circle back with some follow-up questions, and I'll be touching base with our village board and town board. And
if anyone has any questions or wants to read some of the research, you can contact me, and you can give them my information, and they can contact me with if they want articles about stuff that I've talked about or stuff. I'd be more than happy to forward it to them.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay. Thanks.
All right.
Bye.